Well, hello to everyone tuning in tonight on Zoom and on Facebook, and welcome back to Rabble's Off the Hill political panel. I'm Robin Browne, your host for this month's Off the Hill. I am joining you from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, part of Turtle Island, where enslaved Africans built the foundation of Canada's current wealth. My regular co-host, Libby Davies, is on holiday this month, and she returns for our next panel. So February is Black History Month in Canada, and at Rabble, we recognize the need to focus and pay attention to Black history and current Black activism all year round. Our commitment to ending systemic anti-Black racism and equality is fundamental to our work in independent journalism every day. But today, I'm delighted to welcome our panel as we dive into some critical issues facing us in Canada today. So first off, welcome to Matthew Green. Hi, Matthew. Matthew is the new Democratic Party member of Parliament for Hamilton Centre. He's currently the NDP critic for Ethics and Treasury Board and deputy critic for Employment and Workforce Development, Labor and Public Services and Procurement. Matthew is committed to fighting for universal pharmacare, affordable housing, urgent action on the environment, racial justice, and the rights of Indigenous peoples. Welcome, Matthew. Welcome also to first-time Off the Hill panelist, Richard Sharp. Welcome, Richard. Richard has been a human rights advocate for 30 years, both at the community and institutional levels. Until recently, he worked within the Canadian Federal Public Service, where he held several national positions, representing employees as both a union representative and as a leader in employee-led organizations. Richard is currently the director of the Black Equity Branch Treasury Board Secretariat in the Ontario Public Service. His work regionally and nationally is intended to improve the condition of Black and African diaspora communities in Canada. Welcome, Richard. And welcome to another first-timer, Stephen Brown. Welcome, Stephen. Stephen is the CEO of the National Council of Canadian Muslims. He's a well-known leader and community organizer with decades of experience in the private sector, in organized labor, and in human rights advocacy. Welcome to you, Stephen. And as always, it is a pleasure to welcome Carl Nuremberg. Hey, Carl, Rabble's award-winning senior parliamentary correspondent. A special welcome also to everyone who registered for this event on Zoom. Please participate in the chat or ask questions to our panelists through the Q&A function. And as always, we'll do our best to address your questions. And finally, for those of you watching on Facebook, hello, a reminder that if you'd like to participate in future events, simply sign up to Rabble's free newsletter to get a notification for the Zoom invite. Just go to rabble.ca/subscribe. All right. So to kick off tonight's panel, we'd like to focus on the mainstream media and particularly the political reactions to the announcement of Canada's first Islamophobia Commissioner, Amira El-Gawabi. We saw nothing short of vitriolic reaction from Quebec politicians and from the media in general to comments by El-Gawabi and her co-author Bernie Farber in her written observations about Islamophobia in Canada and Quebec's Bill 21, which bans provincial public servants from wearing religious symbols. So this is a question to each of you, and is this: how do you assess the reactions to El-Gawabi, and what are the implications, if any, for members of Black communities who are calling for a Black equity commissioner similar to El-Gawabi, but who would address systemic anti-Black racism? And we'll go Stephen, Matthew, Richard, Carl. So Stephen, to you first.
All right. Hey, thanks so much for having me here. Salut tout le monde. Hello, everybody. Coming to you from Montreal. It's pretty clear that the reaction to her appointment is proof of the necessity of this position. For anybody that's been paying close attention, or even not that close attention to the debate around Bill 21 and how it came to be, it's pretty clear that this Bill 21 is a religiously bigoted law. And the comments that were really targeted by a firestorm in the media were basically coming right after the passing of Bill 21, and really, for anybody who was actually listening to what was going on, to what the Prime Minister of Le Premier Ministre of Quebec, François Legault, was saying, it's very clear that this was done in reaction to a rising malaise in the general population of visible minorities, notably Muslim women. I mean, after they passed the law, he literally said in an interview with Radio-Canada, sometimes you got to give a little bit to the majority because there are some racist people out there who don't want to see people wearing religious garb even in the streets. So I think the entire commentary, the entire reaction to her appointment, is really, really troubling. And I think it points to the fact that this position is really needed. It's absolutely crucial. And when we think about as the Black community, we're a community that's been dealing with discrimination for many years. To me, it highlights the fact that there are some people that are just never going to be comfortable with the fact that you're pointing out discrimination. I mean, that's the reality of the situation. The motion from the bloc against the use of the notwithstanding clause, all the discussion was all about how people feel uncomfortable with being called out for discriminating against minorities. And the fact of the matter is that if you want to make progress, sometimes you're going to have to make some people uncomfortable. I think it's much more important for us to focus on how are we bringing systemic issues to systemic problems. And if those systemic problems are discrimination, well, unfortunately, people who are doing the discriminating are going to be called out, and they may not like it. But I don't think we should pay too much attention to their hurt feelings. I think we should pay more attention to the necessity and ensuring that everybody in this country is treated as an equal. That's what really matters, right?
Thank you, Stephen.
Mm-hmm.
Matthew, over to you. How do you assess the reactions to El Gawabi? And again, what are the implications?
I'm still trying to digest that Stephen just said that Legault went on and actually admitted that, said the quiet parts out loud. Did I understand that correctly, Stephen?
Yeah, he said, I swear, he literally said, I'll quote it in French, pour éviter les extrêmes, des fois, il faut en donner un peu à la majorité, parce que les gens qui sont un peu racistes. Like, that is literally, and I quote what he said.
Wow.
Right? And then when you justify the use of the notwithstanding clause, he basically said something. So it was very, very clear to anybody who was paying attention to the debate in French that this was about curtailing people's rights. Yeah.
And so to that point, I would say that in terms of what is my reaction, or how do I assess the reaction, it's predictable. And we've watched this now for quite some time in the way in which these issues are communicated. It is these arguments about secularism kind of veiling the underlying issues, not just in Quebec, but I would say like across the country. Notions of free speech, right? Notions of freedom of expression. These are all kind of part of a reactionary backlash to multiculturalism. And it's in the midst of a culture war that is, certainly to the point, underscores how necessary it is to explore these topics. The other thing that I want to just really highlight is the ways in which our Black communities exist in so many different ways. The fact that we have Stephen here today, hopefully should be a reminder that when we're talking about Islamophobia, we're also talking about anti-Blackness, because we have a ton of Black Muslims across the country. When you think about the attacks that were happening in Alberta, these were on Somali sisters. When we think about the attacks that have happened in almost all instances of Islamophobia, they have also had Black victims. And I think that one of the ways that we need to be better responding as a community, if I could go further, is to say that we need to recognize that and understand that their struggle is our struggle, even if we don't happen to be Muslim, that our sisters and brothers and family are within the Muslim community and are a part of those attacks. And the rage machine, like what is rewarded right now in media, is rage. And the rage farming that happens has created an ecosystem where small issues, culture war issues, are used to basically drive traffic and drive reaction and to feed a reactionary economy in terms of what we're seeing right now in the media. So again, it's a predictable response. And I would also agree with Stephen that it is a testament that this is exactly what we need in this moment. And I think one of the best examples of that, when they tried to make it about her, and you'll recall Blanchette from the Bloc dragged her into a meeting to basically have her hat in hand apologize for the comments, and then immediately go out and do a press conference calling for her resignation. It was never about Sister Al Gabawi. It was always about the position and the threat to this reactionary culture war that is sometimes driven by ethno-nationalism and other times just driven by straight anti-Muslim hate. And I use that word specifically because, Islamophobia would suggest that people are afraid of Muslims. I'm not sure that's the case. I'm not sure they're afraid of Muslims. I think that there is an underlying hatred that is also fueled by some, a deeply held religious kind of Christo dominionism that some people would like to see in this country. So yeah, buckle up, because I can just predict that things are likely to get worse before they get better.
Thanks. Richard, over to you, man. How do you assess the reaction? And again, what are the implications for, if any, for members of Black communities who are calling for a Black equity commissioner similar to the El Gawabi position?
Yeah, well, I agree with my two brothers here on the panel. What was really disappointing, but as Matthew said, predictable, is that all of this kerfuffle about the comments made back in the day those comments were based on data, were based on reports that were actually released. They were just, restating facts that came out of those reports about the penchant for people who hold anti-Muslim sentiments to support basically anti-Muslim, anti-racialized people who are religious legislation. That they support those things, partly because it's not about the data. It's not about the reality, the truth of data. It's about how people feel. And I did want to go back a little bit to what Matthew was saying, that they might not fear Muslims, but they do fear the change that's coming in this country. They fear the growing numbers of Black and brown people and people with religious who wear religious garments and clothes and express themselves in a non-Pure Len way. And I think that sentiment is across the country. We have declining birth rates in Western nations. Canada is no different. And the saving grace is immigration. That immigration is spawning not only new people coming in, but new people coming in and mixing with the dominant group. So the change is coming quick in terms of the complexion of this country. So it's unfortunate, but I think it's true that we have to figure out a way, if we're talking about solutions, how to manage that fear of the change that's coming. It's not the great replacement, but that a lot of these folks are concerned about. But it definitely is a great changeover in terms of representation in this country. And so for those in Quebec, I could say a lot about our brothers and sisters and colleagues and friends who work in that province. Being the sort of perpetual victim of white Angloism is lost when, in order to sort of defend your sense of self, you have to go after, discriminate against, to belittle, marginalize, racialize people, people of different religious backgrounds. So I think that that's based on the fear of what's coming, and so that is something that sells papers. That is something, that vitriol that comes out of that discomfort with the change that sells papers. That so the media does prey on that. I'll say very quickly, with respects to the Black Equity Commissioner, which a number of us are calling for. I think it speaks to the institutional change that we need to make, or institutional systems and structures that we need to put in place to support people of African descent in this country. We have nothing right now. Employment equity, human rights, even the charter doesn't adequately protect the rights of Black people in this country. That's why we see such disparities in terms of our outcomes in this country. But it does make one pause. Because in just the same way that Amira is going to point out things that are facts and that are statistically grounded in research, so with an equity commissioner, and that will run afoul of the people that are afraid of all this chocolate in the space. So I do agree that it does pose challenges, but it's not insurmountable. It's not impossible. I think we can we can do a lot with such a structure, such an institution. And I think it's going to happen. If not called for by Canadians, then it'll probably be something that's pressed internationally with those of us who are working in the UN and other spaces.
Thank you. And Carl, you wrote about this week, I think this week on this issue. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, so much has been said about it already that this, I don't want to be redundant. I would say where we're going to go from here, so I'll move it forward, is to pick up on Richard's very important point that we have a real reckoning in Canada. I guess we, the majority, but still white majority in Canada, have a reckoning to say, if we did not have immigration, we would disappear as a country. We would start having a declining population, and a declining population is a death sentence. People like me who are senior citizens wouldn't have anybody to pay taxes and work and produce to give us the services and healthcare that we think we're due. We can't live without immigration. We cannot survive without immigration. We're not reproducing ourselves here in Canada without immigration. And we have to, and immigrants by and large are not coming mostly from the old source of immigrants from Europe, but from everywhere else in the world. And more, not only from Asia, as they had for a fair time, a bit of time, and the Caribbean, but also from Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. And many of those immigrants are Muslim or other, or Hindu or other, or Sikh or various other non-Christian religions, and we're going to have to figure out how to make sense of it. I, of course, love it and welcome it. I'll tell you just a personal anecdote how Canada's changed, and I'm the oldest person on this panel. My wife and I lived and worked as CUSO volunteers in the 1970s in northern Nigeria, which is an Islamic part of Nigeria. And I have to tell you, it was a great source of excitement for us. Every once in a while, we'd meet a Nigerian in Canada. There were very few. A Nigerian was an unusual person to run across in Canada. It was a big deal, and we would have a conversation. And now, I mean, you get into a taxi in Toronto, just as likely to be Nigerian as anybody else, or you meet people on the street. And now we have a huge Nigerian diaspora, as we have for many, many other communities. I mean, we didn't know Somali Canadians in the 1970s. This is all completely changed. But we need these people. We absolutely need this energy and this creativity and these people to keep the country moving. And we have to start facing that. And yes, Quebec then becomes the more complicating factor, because Quebecers, when I think of this controversy, I think of that TV commercial for eating eggs for supper, where some guy says, "Oh, you're weird for eating eggs," and then the gal says, "Oh, you're weird for thinking I'm weird." So you have people pointing to Quebec and saying, well, Law 21 is racist. It's as people like me say, Law 21 is not about preserving a secular character of Quebec. It does nothing about preserving a secular character of Quebec. The same time as they're passing that law, the Quebec government is giving the most generous subsidies in the world to religious-based schools, almost all of them Catholic schools. They don't care. I mean, it's just picking on people whose religious practice is visible in some way. So if you have some real crazy fanatic religious person, but he just wears a three-piece suit and goes to work, we don't care about him as long as he doesn't put a sign on his head saying this is my religion. But so you point to Quebec and then they say, well, you're racist for calling us that. And it is sometimes true, and in my article I pointed it out, sometimes there are people who want to pick on Quebec. I had a conversation with somebody I knew who's Jewish and said, it's only in Quebec where you saw signs saying, no Jews or dogs allowed in this hotel. I said, well, I'll tell you a secret. My in-laws who are Jewish, on their honeymoon in Florida, big sign, no Jews, N-word people or dogs allowed, right there. Their car broke down and they just lied. And they just said, we're nice Christian people. Can we just stay here for the night? So, Quebec is no more racist than the rest of North America. As they had fascists in Quebec in the 1930s, you had Nazi rallies in Madison Square Gardens where people were saluting Hitler. I mean, it's not, there's no difference, and it's not fair to pick on Quebec, but Law 21 is a particularly odious and bigoted and racist piece of legislation.
Thank you.
I can just jump in really quickly just to say something that actually points to everything that Matthew, Richard, and Carl were saying. being a Quebecer myself, what's really clear to me is what this really comes down to is the use of the notwithstanding clause. Because in Quebec, it comes back exactly to what does the future of the country look like? And that is why all minorities should be really concerned about this. Because the prevailing attitude in Quebec right now is how we have this great tool. How can we take away the rights of minorities until they have no option but to live like good little French Canadians, right? And as it stands right now, if it turns out that in fact the notwithstanding clause can be used just because, you know, there happens to be a government that thinks it's a good idea to use it to take away our rights, then effectively as minorities in this country, we don't have rights, what we have are permissions, right? Anything that seems to be popular with the majority of citizens, well, then we can do it. And if it's not popular, well, the government can take it away. And that's really, really dangerous. And I think it's important to point out that they did this to Muslim women, brown people who look different than us, right? And a large number of those people who are Muslim women are also Black people, right? Especially in Quebec, sub-Saharan Africans. But when they tried to use the notwithstanding clause to take away the rights of teachers, right? Then the government wanted to do something before they even did it. So for us, this is really a question of, this is a structural question, right? Do we live in a country where provincial governments and the federal government can take away our rights just because the majority of people don't agree with how we live? It's exactly about the multicultural nature of our country and who we are growing into.
Okay, now that's a great segue into our next question, actually. So this kind of relates to, Carl mentioned the getting into a taxi and the driver being Nigerian. Well, that could be an example of one of these many Nigerian doctors who can't get qualified and therefore driving a taxi, for example. And, you know, there are people calling for change, right? Different groups calling for equity. Well, there are strong forces pushing back against groups demanding equity, diversity, and inclusion that are fueling the popularity of people like Jordan Peterson. Okay, so this is a question again for everybody. What is the impact? What impact is this having on media, public discourse, and other areas like education? And how can we resist its spread? And this time we'll go Richard, Carl, Matthew, Stevens. We'll start with you, Richard.
Just to unmute myself. So you're asking about, you cut out there for a second. Just repeat the question.
Oh, did I? Sorry. So, okay, so I'm saying, so strong forces that are pushing back against equity are fueling the popularity of people like Jordan Peterson. So what impact is that having on media, public discourse, and areas like education, and how can we resist it?
Oh yeah, so I think we talked already about media being, the media focuses on those loud dog whistles that get those clickbait and people watching commercials during the intermissions and that sort of thing. Like, media is not really the place that one finds sober stories about how to be thoughtful about what's happening. It's like they're going to amplify people who have views that are racist or anti-Semitic or anti-Black. So I don't have a lot of faith in media unless it's media that people produce. Like, I'm really a fan of the alternative media and the media that people produce on their own through YouTube or Facebook or other means where they can get messages out as long as they're not blocked by the service providers to engage populations. With respects to the public discourse, is and I think Matthew mentioned this before, like we're in for some rough times in the coming days, weeks, months, and perhaps years, where there's been a great failure of sort of neoliberalism in the West, in Canada, in the United States. And people see that people's lives are not getting better. And all this talk about equity and racial equity and human rights for Black folk are not, white people are seeing that they're not doing well either. So there's a backlash against that. You need to have a target. People don't go after governments; they go after the weakest link. It's like people who are abused and lash out, often lash out to the people that won't hurt them back as badly. So the discourse, I think, it reflects this and how, the big bully of, sort of Quebec, I wouldn't say Quebec nationalism, but sort of this white dominant culture, as Carl appropriately said, right now, the majority. That will not be the case in the future. Is pushing back in a way that makes discourse very difficult, because it becomes an emotional discussion. It's not a discussion, again, based on data or facts. It's like how I feel right now, how my people feel right now. I'm on the verge of being extinct. My history and although false grounding makes people feel like, I need to do something about it. So, I think the Jordan Petersons of the world give people an outlet for that. However flawed, however unthoughtful, and not grounded again in data and facts. How do we resist that? I talk to my kids and I talk to people about fortifying ourselves against things like white supremacy and right wing and xenophobia and all that kind of stuff. We do the work internally ourselves, and then we engage our communities. We engage our communities through discussions like this, through actions that are about sort of change and looking at the institutions and not at the people. I don't take it personally when a white person calls me the N-word. I know there's a history there. I think that when a white person called me the N-word, or it's going after my people because we're black or not part of their culture or their background, I'm thinking like this is the time where we need a federal anti-racism strategy that deals with anti-black racism. This is time where we need the work done with the provinces to deal with this stuff in a way that it gets into our schools and gets into our churches. Like, I think this one manifestation of this virulent discourse, this thinking, these beliefs of grounding in culture and history and how we're taught. So for me, it seems grand, but it's not, in my view. It's pieces of a larger puzzle that everybody can, and if we use principles of collective leadership, everybody can chip away at this in their own way in order to sort of change things around. But we're in for a rough time, given the fact that we're on economic slide, and when we're on economic slides, minority groups and racialized people are the ones that are usually hit hard and targeted by those from dominant culture who need a scapegoat.
Yep. No, thank you for that. Carl, these strong forces pushing back against equity, how can we, what impact are they having, and how can we resist?
Well, I'm almost tempted to turn the tables on you, Robin, because I know from some communication we had where you said you actually attended, you mentioned Jordan Peterson, you actually attended a speech that Jordan Peterson gave here in Ottawa. It's a brave man. I mean, that's something I thought, well, I don't have as many years to live as you do, so I don't think I want to waste any precious time of the rest of my life paying attention to Jordan Peterson. And I know that Jordan Peterson gets himself in a lather over gender issues, and he's like one of these people who says a transgender person is not really the other gender, and they're just seeking to use the women's bathroom so they'll exploit our little girls or some such nonsense, and then they carry on about maleness, and he's really into that. I have not heard him or heard of Jordan Peterson particularly, and maybe you can correct me and talk about what he says, how he slides into the issue of race and ethnicity and religion. I do know that people like Jordan Peterson and a lot of others, and people like demagogues like the kind of spouters on CNN, on Fox News in the States, Tucker Carlson and others, are insidious because they're very, very slick and articulate. And Jordan Peterson has a whole intellectual veneer around him. And he is, he's a PhD psychologist, and he's written a number of books, and he has a smooth, slick, glib, somewhat intellectual sounding way of presenting it. And it is a change. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the civil rights movement of the 50s. I'm an extremely old person, when the racists were ignorant sounding people. When the racists were just dumb, ignorant, axe handles, swinging, swearing, fulminating kind of people. Now we've got since we started with political neoconservatism, we have this whole new, essentially what I would refer to as intellectual neo-fascism, personified by people like Jordan Peterson, which is very complex and sophisticated, and it is very scary. And I think, you're not going to cancel these people. You're not going to fight back against these people. And I would remind Richard Sharp that you talk about alternate media. A guy like Jordan Peterson, he made his career through alternate media. He was a YouTube champion. That's how he didn't get regular. It's interesting. We talk about the media. The people on the far right, they rant against the media all the time. They said the mainstream media pays no attention to us. The mainstream media is full of all kinds of woke, politically correct people. We don't go for that. But I give you a couple of, a few just scary examples. We look to the States often, we look to the huge reaction to the murder of Black people by police. But we had Black people murdered by police near me in Hindenburg. A cop murdered a Black, got off. There was at the Bordeaux jail in Montreal, a Black person was murdered by cops. Now they're saying, where's the video? We want to see the video. We want to see what happened. The family want to see what happened. Just today on CBC radio, they talk about a Black man was sitting in a park and somebody gave him a paper cutter. He was fixing a toy and three cops grabbed him and they pulled guns on him. And then they tried to charge him with something. And they actually charged him with holding a weapon or something. And then they threw it out, but they threw out his complaint. So we have a lot of progress to make here.
Indeed. No. Thank you for sure. And I just want to, before I bring Matthew in, respond to what you're saying and let people know. So yes, I did. So Jordan Peterson came to Ottawa on his stadium tour, right? So he was at the Canadian Tire Center. I did attend. Looking around, it looked like it was 5,000 white people and me. So Jordan Peterson, he did the mock debate at the University of Toronto, where he was quoted as saying that the equity, diversity, and inclusion are the evil trinity. All right. So basically, yeah. So then the whole event was like an example of what I call everyday white supremacy, right? It was 5,000 white people who had paid $80 to go see a white guy who considers EDI the evil trinity speak for 2 hours, and whiteness was not mentioned once. Right. So over to Matthew. These strong forces pushing back against equity. What impact do you see them having, especially against in areas like education, right? The attack on critical race theory, that kind of thing. And how can we resist, Matthew? You're on mute.
It's the culture war that we were talking about, and I'm not going to spend any time talking about Jordan Peterson. I don't provide platforms to him and his like, but I think that your first question, and I want to make it very clear, that the point about Quebec not being an outlier is maybe the single most important point that we have tonight. Quebec is absolutely not an outlier. They have their own communications ecosystem, but Jordan Peterson exists for the very reason why the discourse around the Islamophobia directorate is happening in Quebec. And it is tied to the Great Replacement theory. It is absolutely tied to this notion, this fear of loss and longing for a bygone era that the people who you were just discussing, he that shall not be named, makes their money off of. And there's the same rage machine that happens that feeds mainstream media. And I always get a kick of these guys like talking about how marginalized and canceled they are from mainstream media from their op-ed of the National Post, for Christ's sakes. Like, it's ridiculous. But I think rather than have us spend our time chasing the tails of people like him, what we need to do is think about how we can improve the material conditions for people to not fall victim to the reactionary backlash against multiculturalism, to understand that forming radical solidarity within your neighborhoods, literally at the street by street level, being engaged and involved in your community struggles, having solidarity with people across identities and intersections is the only antidote to the isolation and economic despair that people are being fed this intellectual pablum by people like he who shall not be named. And the money to be made in that space, we only have to see it now, where the people who were the yellow vesters became the soldiers of Odin, who became the Proud Boys, who became the convoy, who are now railing against trans story time and like 15-minute communities. It's absurd, but there is money to be made there. And unless we have a radical departure on the way in which we distribute our economy and the way in which we take care of one another and care for one another and love and try to understand one another, the isolation and despair will only continue to feed the beast that is the reactionary experience that is playing out across the country.
Okay.
And again, to just double down on this, for anybody who likes to sit outside of Quebec and think that Quebec is the problem, you're not paying attention, or you're willfully being ignorant, because this is coast to coast to coast, this issue.
All right. No, thank you for that, Matthew. All right. Okay. I want to, with just looking at the time here, we want to get to audience questions too. Oops, another important issue to cover. We've heard a lot about the crisis in our public healthcare system in Canada and the push for privatization. The federal and provincial governments just struck a deal on healthcare funding, and while that got a lot of attention, what got very little coverage was health inequities caused by systemic racism and the detrimental impact privatization of health would have on health equality in Canada. So now, Matthew, I know the NDP has looked into this. Adequate funding and stopping privatization of healthcare have been major issues for the NDP. What's your take on the healthcare deal as it relates to health equity?
Yeah, I mean, the healthcare deal that was touted as being this major investment is really just packaging out prorated investments that were already going to happen anyways. They just did it over 10 years, made an announcement as though it was today, but these things would have taken their course. When the premiers left that meeting without any real criticisms on the deal, we know who got the good deal. And that was the premiers who were able to take that money, public dollars, and allow it to be in a for-profit matrix. And as soon as we have a system of universal healthcare redistributed to the ultra wealthy, to be able to jump the queue, to be able to cannibalize our healthcare workers, our nurses, and our doctors, we have a major issue. And again, every step towards privatization is 10 steps away from health equity, not just racial health equity, although that is certainly a significant issue, but also economic inequality that we're going to see, this Americanization of our healthcare system. And it needs to be stopped dead in its tracks, quite frankly. We need to have conditions that every dollar invested from the public purse needs to stay in the public system, and that we cannot allow for fees to be charged on things that would be covered by our health card. And it is absolutely going to have an impact on health equality across the country, and it's by design. And I'll just say in a very partisan way for a moment, that there's a symbiotic relationship, a ratcheting effect between conservatives and liberals, where conservatives come in with the hatchet and they chop up the service, and then liberals come in and maintain the cuts, and they kill the service. They starve the beast by a death by 1,000 cuts. And so that's what's happening right now. When people like Trudeau call it innovation, what they're really saying is that they want it to be commodified like every other aspect of our existence in life. They want it to be sold. They want it to be commodified and profiteered from. And we're going to have to fight like hell to stop that.
Okay. Carl, I want to bring you in next, because you've had a keen eye on the state of healthcare. How do we make sure that it's not only about money, but also about transforming the healthcare system to one that serves all people equitably?
It's interesting what Matthew was saying about creeping privatization, because in fact, our healthcare system was designed in the 1960s as an insurance system based on the idea that you had hospitals that were quasi-public and you had doctors who were largely private practitioners, and they would charge the insurance on a fee-for-service basis. And then there was a lot of slippage. We had the Canada Health Act, which was to prevent doctors from playing both ends, from charging the insurance system and then charging the patient if they wanted treatment. The problem is, it is precisely, many people I know say, well, we need more competition, we need more private sector, more investment, because we have to have more happening in the healthcare system. And if we have more of the private sector, it'll somehow be good for the public sector. And doctors I know talk that way. It's the reverse that's true. We have too much of the system consists of a little doctor, a family doctor, especially, who has to operate as a kind of small entrepreneur. He's supposed to run a little business. He's supposed to hire people to work with him, work alone, and then charge. He has one payer as the government insurance system, but he is running a little business. What we have to reconfigure the system is we should have doctors and other healthcare professionals and other people related to healthcare working in teams, working together. It's ridiculous that we're dealing with each doctor individually, or even for family medicine, we're extremely lucky, my wife and I, that we're enrolled in a family medicine center where they're not paid per procedure, but they're paid on the basis of the number of patients that they have per year. And that would even be better if we put people on salary. I mean, we don't need more private sector. We need in areas where we don't have private sector now, we need less private sector in areas that have always been private sector. The people who sort of say, oh, you people are crying wolf when you worry about private sector in healthcare. We've always had private doctors operating private practices. You'll build the system. That's right. And it's failed. That's why millions and millions of Canadians don't have a family doctor, because you have each little family doctor working as a little empire and a little businessman. Whereas if you had a proper team approach, and it has to be pushed, it has to be forced. But the federal government, it gives lip service to that. The group that the former health minister was a part of, Jane Philpott, was recommending that, and the federal government says it wants this to happen. It says in its bilateral talks with the provinces, it wants the money to go to reforming the primary care. The problem is that they're not really putting any pressure, and they don't really feel they can get away with it. At the same time, the provinces whine about not getting enough money, but the same problem, the Premier of Ontario, for instance, gave away billions of dollars when he abolished the registration fee for cars, mostly a privilege to people who don't need the money. I mean, you'd be driving a Rolls Royce and you can have 7 Rolls Royces. Suddenly, you don't have to pay. You don't have to register them anymore. You don't have to pay a few $100s. Well, you add all that up, it's billions of dollars a year he's giving away. And then he's saying, oh, the federal government should give me more money. And in fact, David McDonald, who we've had on these panels before, said, there's a lot of money on the table there. In fact, he's the economist with the CCPA. But if you look at previous health agreements, the provinces only spent half of it in healthcare. When you analyze it, they used, some of it, they just gave tax cuts to people or reduced fees for stuff that they wanted to get votes for. So we have a real difficult problem here. I mean, ideally, I would say the federal government has got to be a lot more assertive and aggressive and push harder, offer more money, but say this is how it's spent. But in our federal system, where the healthcare is entirely officially a provincial responsibility, it's very complicated to do that. The people somehow have to pressure both orders of government to say, what we need is a properly organized healthcare system. And there are examples in other countries where we can see where the emphasis is on service, working as teams. The emphasis is on working as people. Doctors shouldn't be business people. Doctors should be doctors.
Carl, thank you for that. I want to bring in again to Stephen just on that. Again, this is this general idea of, again, health equity, right? And it's so crucial. Like, when we talk about systemic anti-Black racism, right? The whole idea of systemic is it means it leads to disproportionate numbers of Black folks, let's say, in jail, in the justice system, disproportionate number of Black students being expelled, streamed into the non-academic programs, and disproportionate health outcomes, like most Black people dying during COVID, for example. So just your thoughts on maybe this deal in particular, but health equity, where we're at.
I think it's really important to look at it from a systemic issue. It just goes to underline the fact that when communities are underserved by public institutions, or when you're facing systemic issues of discrimination, you have a cascading effect. You have a cascading sequence of negative effects. So people have it's harder to access good education. It's harder to access better jobs. When you don't have a good job, or when you're being underpaid, then it's harder to get good nutrition. It's harder to get access to medical care. When medical care is being privatized, that further takes it away. That makes it even more difficult for people who are working people to be able to access healthcare. And so I think it just underlines the fact that we need to be looking at this from a holistic perspective. We need to ensure that everybody has access to good housing, that everybody has access to medical care, decent jobs, loans to start businesses, good education. These are sort of the things that we need to be thinking about. It's about strengthening our communities, right? The idea is, I always believe, my dad always told us this, he was part of the civil rights movement. And one of the founding doctrines of the civil rights movement was, as a community, we should be strong enough to be, we shouldn't have to worry about how other people think about us. We should be able to access the things that we need to have good lives, regardless of how a particular person may feel about you as a Black person. So I think, and that really starts with government programs. To see that they're making sure that as a community, we're holding our politicians and our leaders to account to make sure that we have solutions that work for us, I think is important.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to give Richard an opportunity, considering, Richard, you work with the province now and healthcare is a provincial jurisdiction thing. Anything to add on health equity?
Well, I always have to be careful if I'm talking about what my employer should do. But I guess I'll couch it this way. From my perspective, it appears that healthcare is being purposely put in a state of decline to force the Canadian population to buy into the whole idea of for-profit healthcare as being an option. This sort of egregious lack of access to family doctors that is just growing exponentially. It's forcing people, even people like myself, when I'm looking for healthcare for my family, to think about what the alternatives are going to be if I cannot find a family doctor. If not in Canada, where do I have to go, and do I have to pay for it? I have the means to do that. But so many racialized people, Black, Indigenous, racialized people in this country who are new immigrants, don't have the capacity to just skip out or to pay for healthcare. So it's really interesting to me that we as a society have allowed this steady decline. It's not even steady, it's a rapid decline of access to healthcare, and the what was almost guaranteed back in the day. When I remember when I was a kid, it was like family doctor in every corner. Everybody had a family doctor. You had access to maybe two, but now people have none. And it's, in fact, I had to go in for some work yesterday because I dislocated my finger playing basketball, and I'm shouldn't be trying to play basketball with people so much younger than myself. Every time I go, I get bruised and beaten. So I dislocated my finger, and when I had a conversation with the doctor who was fixing me up, she said she doesn't have a family doctor for herself within the hospital. I was struck by this. I was struck by this. People, I was going to hit her up, where I could find a family doctor, because I always ask. So I think that that's something that is by design. Because I think we can do, as Carl was mentioning, we can do things, and I'm not going to speak for my employer on what the province should do, but I think that our systems should be looking at ways in which we can build sort of communities of practitioners, support them. My friend who was a family doctor said it was very difficult. He went and got specialized. It was difficult to survive, as Carl says, as a small business, when other surgeons and others are making twice the amount of money, right? So it becomes dollars and cents. They go off to the States. So we're losing people. So it's kind of like what's happening in Quebec with the Black and racialized communities that go there. And from what I hear, it's like, if you feel like you've left your home country because you're being discriminated against or persecuted, and then you go to Quebec and you feel you're being discriminated and persecuted, you're going to go off to Montreal, you're going to go off someplace else. And so the drain on the province is significant as more people come in, more people leave. Same with what's happening with Canada in terms of healthcare. So it's just it's troubling. I'm hoping that that people kind of snap out of their malaise and start asking the right questions and demanding that we actually course correct, because this is not something that's just happening. It's deliberate from my perspective.
No, I hear that. Our how old is he now? 21-year-old son right now doesn't have a doctor, and we've been trying to find one, no luck. But So we're getting near the end. So we're going to wrap up with a kind of a more personal question, and that is that hey, it is Black History Month. So we just wanted to ask each of you, what does Black History Month mean to you personally? And I guess we'll go Matthew, Stephen, Richard, and then end up with Carl. Matthew.
I think it's a time of personal reflection and a doubling down on centering issues of improving the material conditions for the Black community and for working class people across the country. I think that my best anti-racism strategies is improving material conditions for people, and it's an opportunity for us to celebrate and create our own narratives and not be led by what other people have to say about our communities, everything from celebrations to deeper organizing, socializing, and celebration. And so I really want to take this moment to thank all of you for sharing this space with me tonight, and certainly look forward to the ongoing conversations to come.
Thank you. Stephen.
Yeah, I think Black History Month is a really important time to have a conversation as a country as to who Black Canadians are. My family has been here for 7 generations. We came in through the Underground Railroad. I mean, we've fished the rivers, built the companies, fought the wars of this country. We were here before Canada was Canada. And it's not just my family. There are hundreds of families. There are thousands of people, who have been part of making this country what it is. And so we are here. We continue to be here. Our story is the Canadian story. And it's also, I think, an opportunity for us to get together and have a conversation about where we're going as a Black community. The Black community is a diverse community. It has people who come from all corners of the world, who have all different faiths, who practice all different religions. And as Matthew said, have a conversation about what are some of the things that unite us, what are our common struggles, and how do we build up our community? How do we improve the material conditions of ourselves and our families? How do we make sure that the country of tomorrow, Canada of tomorrow, is better for our children than what it is today? And I think it's also an opportunity for us to flex who we are. There's millions of us in the country. And I love to take the opportunity in February to look at the politicians, to look at the leaders of our country, to look at businesses, to have a conversation with media and say, what are your plans? What are you doing? What are you doing that benefits me? How are you including me? How are you thinking about my family, my mother, my father, my neighbors, right? Where's my story? Where are our interests? And so, it's always a pleasure to be able to have these conversations. I think it's always February is always a time where we can sort of get back and center ourselves and think about who we are and where we're going. And if there's one thing I would say is, the struggle of the Black community in Canada is one that has been going on for generations. And we've gone from success to success. And I think if we keep doing this, we'll see even more success. And so I look forward to working with everybody here and continuing to improve our lives and continuing to improve our country and ultimately the world. So.
Thank you. Richard.
Yeah, I used to always feel a little bit irritated by all the calls for us to speak, and Matthew knows, I'm sure Stephen knows, Robin knows, Black History Month is the time where people want to hear about the issues, and then for the other 11 months of the year as if we don't exist. So I always say that we should not be relegated to the coldest and shortest month of the year. Black History Year is 365 days. It's Canadian history, as my brothers have stated, and there should be a big celebration on Emancipation Day, August 1st. But I do use it now as a means to start conversations around Black futures in this country, to push initiatives and thought and work around the UN International Decade of People of African Descent, various issues like the Black Equity Commissioner and other things that speak to institutional change. This is not just history, although history is critically important because our peoples have been here for generations, and some call themselves indigenous because they've been here so long. But I do think that we can use the Black History Month as a springboard for conversations and dialogue. And so I that's what I do. So we don't end up talking about history. We talk about what it is we need to do to correct this ship, to steer it away from the icebergs and the rocks and back into open water. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues in the struggle on this call, Carl, Matthew, Stephen, and of course you, Robin. We've always been sort of tirelessly working for the betterment of our peoples in this country. It's been great to spend the time with you this evening.
Thank you. And last word over to Carl.
Oh, I don't know. It's not much to say. It's very hard to top anything that has been said, but I would say that I am looking forward to having Matthew Green as our first Black Prime Minister. I think that would be great. And I'm very impressed with everybody's articulate statements. At a very, very entirely almost cliched, maybe stereotype personal level, my personal big connection from early life with the Black community in Montreal, where I'm from, was through music, was for going down to the historic Black community area of Montreal, Little Burgundy, and going to after hours jazz places where you had Nelson Simons and Charlie Biddle playing, and later Oliver Jones, and even sat down and jammed sometimes with some of these incredible people, and then sort of to make the circle. More recently, I have had the great good fortune to play with a young lady who just got here a few years ago as a refugee from Haiti, named Samantha Christ Francois, who can sing in 5 languages, and she had to get out of Haiti, she said, because life was too dangerous. She had a baby here, and she's trying to get status here, and she's having a hard time getting the Canada to recognize her as a true refugee, but she's persevering. She got herself a job, and she's making lots of music. And I asked my daughter, who works with refugees all the time, I said, why is it so hard? And she said, the highest rate of rejection still, all our talk of being compassionate towards refugees and all our legitimate concern for the Ukrainians, for instance, the highest rate of rejections for Haitians. And I said, well, why are Haitians so often rejected? They have such good reason to seek refuge. And she only had one word for it. It's got to be racism. But I'll keep working with this young lady and with the people I know. And again, keep, great work you people are doing. And really, Matthew Green for PM. I'm starting the campaign now.
Well, there's a good note to end and start on. Well, thank you very much. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks to Stephen Browne, Matthew Green, Richard Sharp, and Carl Nuremberg for being part of another great conversation. Our live political panel series will return on March 23rd, so be sure to get an invitation for that event by signing up for Rabble's newsletter at rabble.ca/subscribe. And finally, thank you as always to Rabble for creating this space to host these important discussions. And on that note, Rabble is in the final days of their winter fundraiser. So please support that and events like this by donating to rabble.ca/donate. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and see you next month.